All right, good afternoon, Charlie and Marlowe fans, or whenever you happen to be tuning into this video. I am Cole here, trying to expand upon the content. Largely a baseball-centric channel, but still want to bring a little bit more to it. I'm going to be taking care of some content on the channel, football-related, college football today. We'll do some NFL content a little bit later, but obviously the topic of discussion as I'm recording this video is the College Football Playoff Committee. Did they get it right? What happened in Conference Championship Weekend? Did the committee make the right interpretations of what happened in Conference Championship Weekend? I wanted to wait until after the bowl games were released, or at least the New Year's Six Bowl, before I hopped on here, so we can get into a little bit of that, and we'll obviously take care of that at the end of this little episode, if you will, because that is not what is the most important right now. Most important, let's start at the top. All right, Michigan number 1, Washington number 2, Texas number 3, Alabama number 4. Did the committee get it right? I say yes. And a lot of people were talking about how Florida State got jobbed. They come in at number 5. But despite their 13-0 record, I did not think that it was appropriate to include Florida State in the Final Four. And it's unfortunate. They played everybody on their schedule, and they are technically a Power 5 team. But despite all of that, I still think it made more sense for Alabama to go into the playoffs instead of them. And there are two ways to build a resume here. You can either build the resume top down or bottom up. And I think a lot of people typically lean on the bottom up. But I think if you balanced it out between the two strategies, Alabama probably does make the most sense here. So bottom up, let's start at what's your worst moment. Florida State has 0 losses. So if you created a Final Four of just the bottom up strategy, you have certainly Michigan, Washington, and Florida State as your stone cold top 3, some variation of them, because they all have 0 losses. And then who would your fourth team be? You have 3 12-1s, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia. And that one's really simple to figure out because Texas beat Bama and Bama beat Georgia. So figure that one out. Texas is probably your number 4. Florida State's probably your number 3. But I find, and it's not just this year, it's a lot of years, where the discourse around college football and the playoff rankings is very BCS-esque. And I don't think a lot of people remember why we clamored so hard for a playoff committee, because we wanted the eye test to matter. We wanted the BCS to shut down because we didn't want a bunch of computers just telling us what all the numbers said. We wanted the eye test to matter. And in doing so, the system that we begged for a decade ago, and maybe some of you might say that in hindsight we were wrong for begging for this scenario, which I heavily disagree with. The only thing that I would disagree with actually would be the expansion of the playoffs, and now it's about to expand even further. So a bunch of teams now who get 2 mulligans in the regular season are going, and potentially 3 in some situations, are going to be competing for the national championship unjustly. So I think expansion was the biggest mistake, but I have no problem with the committee featuring the eye test. And the eye test absolutely favors Alabama. Now, they do have a loss. They have a loss at home against Texas, and Texas controlled that entire game. So no question about it, that was a true loss. And what I mean by that, for example, Texas's one loss was against a good Oklahoma team at the very end of that game, and it was a game that Texas probably should have won because they were mostly the better team that game, despite the fact that they had some untimely turnovers that really flipped the script of that game. They left some points on the board committing turnovers deep in Oklahoma's territory. So Texas was, even in their one loss, was probably the better football team that day. Can't say the same about Alabama. They had a definitive loss to Texas. They were not really tremendously competitive in that game. But despite that, that's looking at it at the floor and working the bottom up. What was your worst moment? Let's look at it top down. Top down, what was your best moment? Alabama did something that Florida State couldn't have done even if Jordan Travis were healthy. And that is beat the number 1 team in the country. Georgia, I didn't have a big problem with them being ranked number 1. I guess you could have made the argument that Michigan could have been ranked number 1. But no matter how you slice it, whether you thought Georgia was the best team or the second best team in the country, Alabama beat them. They controlled that entire game after Georgia's opening touchdown. Georgia came out really hot, and then after that, Alabama took care of the rest of the game. And, they only lost by a field goal. Well, there are many ways to lose by a field goal, but what happened in that game was Georgia was down by 10, and then at the end of the game scored a touchdown to make it look like a 3-point game. Okay, that wasn't some back and forth. Georgia was leading and then gave it up just because Alabama had the last possession. That's not how that game went. Alabama controlled the entire game, and no matter how you win that game, I don't think Florida State could have beaten Georgia, at least not on any sort of consistent level. And so, top down, Alabama had the better resume. And so you got to find the balance of the two. Which one wins out? Do you look at their best moments or their worst moments? How do we kind of meet in the middle? And the way that you meet it in the middle is Florida State would be entering the playoff with their backup quarterback. I think that matters. And it's unfortunate. Is it necessarily fair? I wouldn't say that it is a 100% integrity play to leave Florida State out of the playoff, because if you were going just based off of 100% integrity, then yeah, Florida State went undefeated. No question about it. But I think if you even leave a little bit of room just for eye test and feel, Alabama eye test better than Florida State, and they feel like more of a playoff team than Florida State does. So I think just blindly looking at the records in this one, when there was only one game that separates them, I think you're kind of leaving some context on the table there. And again, this is something that we begged for a decade ago. So let's take advantage of the system that we asked for. We can't just stack up all the 0-loss teams, stack up all the 1-loss teams, stack up all the 2-loss teams, because breaking news to all of you, not all conferences are created equal. And by the way, and this is something that people don't really pay attention to, not all power conferences are created equal. We kind of created the divide where we have 10 conferences and it's a Power 5 and a Group of 5, and that's the separator. But there are separations and breaks all throughout the conferences. Okay, not all Power 5 conferences are created equal. So Florida State, being one of the only teams near the top of the rankings who didn't have to play a playoff contender, that factors into this. They had a great first impression, a phenomenal first impression of the season, beating LSU in Orlando, crushed them. And LSU is a good football team. They're not a great football team, but they're a good football team. And the way that they won, I classify that as a great win. It wasn't an elite win. All right, so we got good, great, and elite. It was a great win because they dominated a good team. That absolutely mattered. But as you trail away from that opening week, Florida State progressively has looked more and more pedestrian. Despite winning their games, not exactly winning all of them in impressive fashion. And now we reach a point where Jordan Travis, who I think is a really good quarterback, got hurt. And so now, do you want to enter the playoffs with Tate Rodemaker? And just from a fan standpoint, as a viewer standpoint, let's take this into consideration. Because I think a lot of you who are begging for Florida State in the playoffs are going to be likely hypocritical at the end of this, because when Georgia beats the brace off of Florida State, it's what I suspect is going to happen in what I believe is the Orange Bowl. I think a lot of you are going to be very glad that you didn't see Florida State waste your time in a playoff performance getting ran out of the building by Michigan. So Alabama is much more built to compete for a national championship. 4 best teams. Well, first of all, I don't even know where the breakoff point for the 4 best teams. Is Georgia one of the 4 best teams? If they played Alabama 10 times, what would have happened? It could have been a 5-5 split. So Georgia is certainly up there. Oregon had to play 2 playoff teams. Washington twice. And they played Washington tough both times. But you know what? It's not fair. It's not even remotely fair for Washington to potentially be in a playoff where they have to prove that they're the national champions by beating Oregon 3 times. So Oregon's out of it. But a lot of these teams at the top, Michigan played Ohio State, Washington played Oregon twice, Texas played Bama, Georgia played Bama, Ohio State played Michigan, Oregon played Washington twice. Florida State is the only team who was a playoff contender who did not play another playoff contender at any point in the season. So yes, they're a Power 5 undefeated champion, conference champion. But definitively, they were in one of the worst conferences in the Power 5. Not all Power 5 conferences are created equal, which is why I think it's a huge mistake, by the way, that as we expand to 12 teams, I've already aired out a bit of my grievances with that, with how I think that's not exactly beneficial. It'd be fun for TV, but I don't think it's good to allow 10-2 teams and potentially 9-3 teams to compete for a national championship. As we expand to that format, what we're going to see is conference champions be locked in with an automatic first-round bye. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense because, again, not all power conferences are created equal. We kind of created a system or a colloquial system, that's a tough word to say, that we kind of agree upon, that it's the Power 5 and then really the Power 4. So it's going to get even easier next year because the initial plan was to have 5 power conference champions competing for 4 first-round byes, but now with the dissolution of the Pac-12, we are going to have 4 power conferences, and all the conference champs are going to get the first-round byes. I think that's a mistake because you could have a situation, obviously, where a Florida State team who we have, or at least I shouldn't say we, who the committee has deemed to not be a top 4 team, could get bumped up and get a first-round bye despite not being a top 4 team. Or you could have the absolute doomsday scenario, which likely won't happen, but I'll give you an example from either 2018 or 2019, where an undefeated Clemson team appeared in the ACC championship game against a 7-5 Pitt team because Pitt's side of the region was just terrible. And so, what would happen in that scenario? What if Pitt pulled the shocking upset and was an 8-5 team with the first round bye in the college football playoffs? I don't think that's a very good decision either, but that's the reality that we live in, and we'll deal with that when we deal with it. So we can worry about that next year. But not all power conferences are created equal. It's not just the divide between the Power 5 and the Group of 5. There's divides everywhere. And Florida State's conference, being as weak as it was, enabled them the opportunity to skate by without having to face the challenges that the 7 teams that surround them had to face. Some of them, as I mentioned, Texas, Alabama, and Oregon and Washington, those 4 teams all had to play 2 playoff contenders at some point on their schedule. And Florida State had to play 0. That's just the reality of it, folks. So, you'd like to see a 13-0 team get in there because, hey, as Joel Klatt says, and I agree with a lot of things that Joel Klatt says, and I disagree with probably even more that he says, but one thing that he has been championing for years and years and years is that wins have to matter. So if you win your games, that has to account for something. And I kind of get that. But at the same time, then why not have just Michigan, Washington, Florida State, and Liberty? Liberty's a D1 team. They're competing for the same national championships. All right, we've already decided that it's okay to acknowledge that the Conference USA is a step beneath the Power 5. Why can't we admit that the ACC is a step beneath the Pac-12? That doesn't seem crazy to me. So I don't have the biggest problem with Florida State being eliminated here. And they were incapable of doing what Alabama did, Texas did, Washington, and Michigan. Florida State would not have beaten Ohio State. So Michigan clears that. Florida State probably wouldn't have beat Oregon once, let alone twice. Washington clears them. Texas beat Alabama. I don't think Florida State would have done that. When I say that, I don't mean on one given day. I mean, if you played them 10 times, I think Alabama would have beaten Florida State more often than not. So I think Texas's win against Alabama is more impressive than anything Florida State's done. And Alabama's win against Georgia is more impressive than anything Florida State's done. So there you go. Florida State's eliminated, that's fine. So now I guess as I kind of juggle some ideas here on what to do, this is very much impromptu. Who were the 4 teams if you were to build a bottom-up resume? Again, just to reiterate, it would have been Michigan, Washington, Florida State, and then probably Texas. Could have been Liberty if you wanted to. That's a bit far-fetched, but could have been Liberty. Now at the top, let's discuss the top. If you build a top-down resume, probably Washington. Washington beat Oregon, who I think is a hell of a football team. And I'm just being completely honest with you. I think Oregon is one of the top 4 teams in college football. Now, they lost their biggest game of the year twice. That's not playoff material. So I'm not advocating for them to make the playoffs and compete against a bunch of 13-0 teams when they're 11-2. That's not fair. And most of all, it's not fair to Washington to have to prove, as I said earlier, that they need to beat Oregon or be better than Oregon 3 times in one season just to prove that they're national champions. So that's not fair. But Oregon, one of the best teams in college football. So I'm giving Washington probably the bump as top down, could have been the number 1 team. That's actually really important because I'm pretty sure it's the case where the conferences determine which bowl games you go to. And so Michigan being ranked number 1, I'm going to operate on that assumption. I assume that the Big Ten and their relationship with the Rose Bowl decided to send Michigan to the Rose Bowl. I know Michigan's playing in the Rose Bowl against Alabama, which is going to be glorious, by the way, on New Year's Day, or whenever they play these games. I hope it's on New Year's Day, but give or take a couple days. I think the Big Ten probably orchestrated that. So that sends Michigan and the number 4 team, Alabama, to the Rose Bowl, and that leaves Washington to the other bowl game that was inevitably going to be a playoff game, which is the Sugar Bowl. And so Washington draws Texas. Why is this significant, Washington versus Texas at number 1? Because Washington could have played Texas in Pasadena on the West Coast, opposed to playing Washington against Texas in New Orleans, which is not that far from Austin. So if the conferences, if the Pac-12 had their first bid above the Big Ten to choose Washington to do a bowl game, Washington would have been playing on the West Coast instead of having to go a few hours away from Austin. I have no idea how far away Austin is from New Orleans, but I do know that it's one state over. So there actually is a little bit of an advantage. Texas is absolutely thrilled. Now, Texas would have drawn Michigan, so Texas would have been playing probably, if you assume that they're above Alabama because they beat them no matter what, Texas probably locked into the 3 seed regardless of who's 1 or 2, whatever. Texas was probably going to be playing in New Orleans anyway because either Washington or Michigan, both of their conferences would have been sending them to the Rose Bowl. So Texas is going to be playing in New Orleans, a virtual home game, either against Michigan or Washington. So Texas really lucked out in this situation. And so Michigan versus Washington, who has to deal with that? Washington draws the short end of the stick. Despite, as I just said, building a resume top down, Washington's probably number 1, beating Oregon twice. That's more impressive to me. Number 2, top down. We could toy around here. We could go with Michigan or Alabama. I would say Alabama's loss, if we're trying to meet this in the middle. Or actually, you know what? Screw that. I just said that we're only going to do top down, so we won't even worry about the losses. Alabama's win against Georgia, I put it up there. That's number 1. I should say number 2 beneath Washington there. That was a fantastic win, and actually probably a better individual win than Washington beating Oregon either time. But Washington did it twice. Alabama only had to do it once. They do have some good wins on the resume as well. I know that people are freaking out because they toyed around with Auburn. That doesn't really bother me all that much. But Alabama and what they put together this season, especially highlighted by their victory against Georgia, that's very impressive. So I would actually put their top-down resume at number 2. And then Michigan probably number 3 with their win against Ohio State. That was the most impressive. Texas at Alabama. Texas could be number 4 there. The issue is it was a different Alabama team. Jalen Milroe was terrible. Jalen Milroe started the season terribly. And then we resulted in a Jalen Milroe benching against South Florida. They almost lost that game. And then Jalen Milroe comes back against Ole Miss, wins that game, and launches an incredible second half of the season. So how much do you value Texas' win there in this little hypothetical that we're playing here when it's a completely different Alabama team? So I would actually, despite the fact that Texas beat Bama, I would probably put Alabama beating Georgia above Texas in this situation. So the top-down resume, which no matter how you rank them 1 through 4, likely features Michigan, Washington, Texas, and Alabama. So that's the conclusion of all of this, is that they did view this at the top. They didn't view this at the bottom. They didn't try to play an elimination game. They wanted to be impressed. That's what they came up with. I don't think that's a crazy strategy. I really don't. Because it's something that we begged for long ago. And now that we're getting what we asked for, and now we want to throw a fit. Look, folks, Florida State was not going to compete in the college football playoffs. And so if you're just interested, especially if you're a casual college football fan who's just tuning in and wants to see good competition, Florida State was not going to provide you with that. And look, I don't know any of the Florida State players, neither do you. So we can feel a little bit bad for Florida State, and I do. I do feel bad for Florida State, but is it going to wreck our entire year that Florida State didn't make the college football playoffs? No. All right, let's cut it out. We're fine. So, That's the college football playoff breakdown. We got some bowl games coming up. I already alluded to Florida State matching up with Georgia. I like Georgia in that one. Florida State's on their backup quarterback. I'm sorry. Georgia also just a flat-out better football team. I do like, by the way, that Georgia did not get in, because if they got in, which some people were saying, I saw Matt Leinart say it on the post game yesterday after the Big Ten championship, that Georgia still had an argument for getting in. And I guess they did. It wasn't much of an argument, but I guess they had some level of an argument. I'm glad that they didn't get in, because that would have been entirely based on what happened the past 2 years, and those were different teams with different quarterbacks, different players, different defensive players, certainly. What happened the past 2 years should not have any bearing on whether or not Georgia makes the playoffs this year without even winning their conference. So, happy to see that, but they're still going to blow out Florida State, in my opinion. What else we got? Ohio State and Missouri go to Dallas and are facing off in the Cotton Bowl. Ohio State, even with what I assume to be a sitting out Marvin Harrison, or I should say without Marvin Harrison, Ohio State just flat out has more talent in this game. And I know Missouri's trying to play the underdog America's team role. They tried to steal that title from Michigan. Ohio State is a more talented team. They have far better players on defense. We'll see if JT Tuimoloau plays, because I think he's got the potential to be a first-round pick. Regardless of if he's a first-round pick, he's going to be a second-round pick. He's going to be a high draft pick. He may sit out of this game. But Ohio State has better players across the board, except for possibly Luther Burden. Luther Burden could definitely start on Ohio State's team in that receiver core. Cody Schrader could probably start at running back, or at least mix in the rotation, because Ohio State has a whole stable of backs, headlined by Trevion Henderson, who I was not always thrilled with, but this year I had to tip my cap to him. When he returned from injury, he made a big difference in that offense. So I think the running backs are a bit of a wash between Cody Schrader and Trevion Henderson. I know the stats significantly favor Cody Schrader. So in any sort of like season-long awards, I am certainly picking Cody Schrader. But as far as like drafting a team with either of these two, probably Trevion Henderson. I think he's a more talented, more skilled player. We got Penn State and Ole Miss. I forget which game they're going to. Not the Fiesta Bowl. Probably the Chick-fil-A Bowl is what's left. Gotta be honest, I don't care a whole hell of a lot for that game. Although I think both teams, this is pretty evenly matched. I think both of these teams kind of profile the same way as far as where they stack up in their conferences. Definitively in that tier beneath Alabama and Georgia is Ole Miss, and definitively beneath the tier of Michigan and Ohio State is Penn State. So as far as these two drawing each other, I think it's a fair game, no question about it. We also have Oregon and Liberty. Whether Bo Nix plays or not, this is blowout city. This is blowout written all over it. Congratulations to Jamie Chadwell in his first year with the Liberty program, which, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I didn't even really realize that Liberty was a giant step up from Coastal Carolina. I thought that was somewhat of a lateral move. Now, I didn't have a ton of research on the subject, but when Jamie Chadwell left Coastal Carolina to go to Liberty, I was kind of shocked by that. But here he went there. He went 13-0 in his first year there, and he's playing in the Fiesta Bowl. And his team's going to get run out of the building. But you know what? They're going to have a lot of fun. They're going to have probably a lot of players going to the state of Arizona for possibly the first time, aside from recruiting visits, with Liberty being in Lynchburg, Virginia. They're going to get to experience something new. They're going to have fun. They're going to do all the pregame warm-up stuff where they'll have like Oregon versus Liberty trivia night or something like that. So it'll be team bonding. It'll be fun, but Liberty has no chance of winning this game. And if the spread is anything less than 30, I recommend you take Oregon in this game, whether it's Bo Nix or Ty Thompson playing quarterback. So there you go. They're the New Year's 6 games. I don't think I missed any there. Anything else that we would like to address as I pull up FanDuel again, just to kind of get a gauge for not just what my opinions are as I have espoused for the past 24 minutes and 25 seconds, but also what the real experts think, who have no emotion in anything, and all they pay attention to are numbers. So I'm going to pull up the math here. We got national championship odds. Michigan at plus 170 is your headliner, followed by Alabama. Okay, so they're basically declaring already that the winner of Alabama and Michigan is going to win the championship. Texas, right behind them at plus 250, And then Washington appears to have no shot at plus 750. So Washington is the first team that everybody's eliminating, or I shouldn't say everybody, but that the smart people are eliminating from potentially winning the national championship. We transition to the Heisman Trophy, where we have Jaden Daniels as a minus 1450 favorite. That line kind of moved around between 1,400 and 1,300. Who cares? Jaden Daniels is going to win the Heisman Trophy. I did a whole video about the Oregon-Washington fallout and what that meant for both the national title landscape and the Heisman landscape. And I expressed my concerns that the Heisman voters would jump on board with Michael Penix because despite Bo Nix being the heavy favorite for the better part of the second half of the season, Michael Penix having a better performance in a conference championship, sealing up a playoff spot, doing it head-to-head against Bo Nix. I thought a lot of people in 1 week would have just rode a giant wave going from Bo Nix to Michael Penix. Joe Klatt being one of those people, by the way. We just saw that. He was tweeting at somebody, I forget who, but he said that Michael Penix Jr. put together a Heisman-level performance in the Pac-12 championship game, which I guess he did, but this is not a one-game award. So Michael Penix, despite the fact that I think he is way up there and will be in New York, and according to the odds, he's the second highest favorite, although a distant second behind Jaden Daniels. Jaden Daniels is going to justly win the Heisman Trophy, in my opinion. So I'm not going to hold his terrible defense against him because he did his part in moving the football. Defense didn't exactly do their part in stopping the other team from doing the same. So Jaden Daniels, number 1. Michael Penix, number 2. Bo Nix, number 3. And just for fun, Jalen Milroe is number 4. So RG3 may get his wish. Again, he declared that Jalen Milroe, should he beat Georgia, should be the Heisman Trophy winner. And no. Heisman Trophy winners don't get benched. But also just the fact that Jalen Milroe has a shot to go to New York is pretty impressive. And also speaks to how incredible he was down the stretch of the season. All right, lines here. Ohio State opens up as a 6.5-point favorite against Missouri. I think it should be more than that. I think Ohio State is a significantly more talented football team. I bag on them every chance I get. I can't stand Ohio State, to quote Ric Flair, but they're just flat out far more talented than Missouri is. There's no question about that. And Missouri took advantage, to their credit, by the way, took advantage of what was kind of like a weaker version of the SEC. This is one of the weaker years that we've ever seen in the SEC, at least in my lifetime. Certainly didn't resemble the SEC of my childhood. So Missouri took advantage of that. Rode that to a 10-2 season when they had historically been a 500 program under Eli Drinkwitz. And Ohio State didn't really play anybody. The Big Ten was weak as hell as well. So they took advantage of that up until playing Michigan and losing that game, of course. But Ohio State's a better football team. And I think, despite the fact that Missouri did play Georgia pretty tough, and that was in Georgia, I think Ohio State played Michigan closer than Missouri played Georgia. So I'm going to go Ohio State minus 6.5. And if any of you put money on this just because I said that right now, you are foolish. Penn State and Ole Miss. 3.5-point favorite right there. What would I have expected? Penn State being favored by 3.5, by the way. I think that's about fair. Certainly would have expected it to be close. As I mentioned, these two teams basically have the exact same makeup, and they're just like Penn State is just Ole Miss North, and Ole Miss is just Penn State South. That's kind of how this works out. So I'm not surprised that the line is that close. Georgia minus 14 against Penn State. I'm sorry. Georgia minus 14 against Florida State. There you go. That tells you everything you need to know. That's what we discussed earlier. Florida State was going to be non-competitive. So all of you who actually watched the Michigan game when they go up against Alabama, you're not going to be asking for Florida State to be a part of that game. So it helps our viewing experience. Liberty and Oregon. Oregon minus 14. Get the hell out of here. Oregon's going to blow them out. I think Florida State, even with Tate Rodemaker, is closer to Georgia than Liberty is to Oregon, even without Bo Nix. Oregon minus 14 is ridiculous. That's my conclusion. Michigan, 1.5-point favorite. This is going to be in the Rose Bowl, remember. 1.5-point favorite against Alabama. There you go. There's your competition. Georgia minus 14 against Florida State, and Michigan minus 1.5 against Alabama. And I 100%, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I 100% think that there should be some odds makers who reside within the College Football Playoff Committee. I think that would be beneficial. I think that would actually, with zero emotion, just math, just numbers, put some odds makers in there. Doesn't have to be full of odds makers, but if you want to just say, hey, here are the people, regardless of resume, if they lined up, this is what's going to happen, I think that'd be pretty good. And it worked out that way anyway. We didn't even need them this year. Michigan 1.5 point favorites against Alabama. That is going to be nip and tuck. And we'll conclude this with Texas minus 4.5 against Washington. I wonder how much of that has to do with geography. Because remember, Texas doesn't have to go that far to travel to New Orleans. Washington has to go quite far for it. So what would have happened if they kind of had an equal distance from Seattle down to Southern California versus Austin down to Southern California and meeting somewhat in the middle? I don't know. But Washington appears to be the odd man out as far as who's going to win the national championship. So there's the whole breakdown. We did the rankings, we did bottom up, we did top down, blah, 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 blah. We did New Year's Six Bowls, we did lines, we did Heisman Trophy, we did everything. So it's time for me to get out of here. Subscribe, like, blah, 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 comment. Whether you like this video or hate this video, drop a comment. Just let us know what you think. Kill me, whatever you want. Say that my hair is weird. A lot of you do. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. Let's go. So keep tuning into the Charlie Marlowe YouTube channel. We have a ton of great content here, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And more college football and NFL content coming from me. Thank you.